today is Swift Sword, the true story of the Marines of Mike 3-5 in Vietnam, 4 September 1967. The presenter today via Zoom, you can see him in the upper right corner, is the book's author, Doyle Glass. Doyle is from Midland, Texas. He received a law degree from Southern Methodist University and began his career as a criminal prosecutor, working as an assistant district attorney in Texas. Later, he became an assistant attorney general in Kentucky, prosecuting some of the most violent crimes in the state. During his spare time, must have been very small, he developed passions for creating art and writing, resigned his role as a prosecutor, and became a professional sculptor. Could I have the first sculptor's one? And these next two slides show his two main sculptors of Medal of Honor winners. This first one is for the Texas Medal of Honor. And then the second one that we have is Kentucky. And you can see that these are really serious sculptures. They're, he put a lot of work and effort into this, reflecting his interest and his admiration for the soldiers who served. So he then, after doing these sculptures, published his first book, Lions of Medina, in 2007. And if some of you may recall that in June of 2024, when Jim Ramsey was making his presentation on the book, Lions of Medina, Doyle joined us via Zoom for the Q&A. Today, he's going to discuss his book, Swift Sword, based on interviews with over 50 people who were involved in that battle, a ferocious battle, a battle for survival of the Mike Company of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The book has sold over 25,000 copies, and in 2023 received the Outstanding Book of the Year Award for Best Nonfiction, the 2023 Pencraft Award. Despite his acclaim as sculptor and author, Doyle is most proud of his role as loving husband to his wife and 3 children. He resides in Dallas, Texas. Doyle, proud to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, and I tell you, it's a real honor to be here. I really appreciate you having me. I chose this particular company, or found out about this particular company, because of the heroism exhibited by these Marines and Navy corpsmen. Just in this one day on September 4th, 2 Medal of Honors were awarded, and at least 2, maybe 3 Navy Crosses, I would have to check on that, were awarded. So that one day stood out for me. With Lions of Medina, if you recall, that was more of a 13-month tour of duty, what a Marine experienced from leaving boot camp, being shipped over, and if surviving, coming home. This book intended to be more of what does one day in Vietnam look like. So to set the stage, we're in September 1967. Earlier that year, from interviews with North Vietnamese leaders, we learned that the overall North Vietnamese strategy to win this war depended in large part on inflicting large numbers of casualties on American servicemen and women to turn the tide of public opinion against the war. That turned out to be a fairly successful strategy. And part of the reason for that is that the North Vietnamese had manpower, but of course they didn't have the military weapons to actually win the contest militarily. So in preparation for the Tet Offensive, which was in early in the year of 1968, the North Vietnamese authorized a series of individualized attacks. So the North Vietnamese determined that they needed to initiate attacks on American bases in preparation for the Tet Offensive, which was early 1968. The Khe Sanh Valley is an area in the northern part of South Vietnam that was produce rich, considered a breadbasket for the region, and also an area of key control for those northern provinces in South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese considered the area, and we can go to the next slide. This area near the Li River and the village of Dong Son, which is in the lower left-hand corner, which will be the southwest. The NVA considered that region as a key area where the Americans could basically launch their own attack to get control of that entire region of the Khe Sanh Valley. And that determination came from the two Marine battalion bases that you see on this map. So in the southwest corner of the map, we have Hill 51, which was the battalion base for 1-5. And we're talking about 800 men or so, maybe 1,000, but roughly 800 to 1,000. And then in the northern part of the map, Hill 63, 3-5. So we've got approximately 1,600 Marines. That's not that many to try to control this entire region. But the NVA saw it as an area of concern and an area where they could lure out Marines to attack and kill them piecemeal. And that's part of their overall strategy. So with that being said, we can see again the village of Dong Son in the lower southwest corner. On September 3rd, 1967, South Vietnam held presidential elections. The company, about 164 Marines, Delta 15, nicknamed by the other Marines as Dying Delta because they tended to have not great luck in the field, had been sent to provide security for Vietnamese citizens to have that election on September 3rd, in case there was any trouble. As night fell on the evening of September the 3rd, Delta Company 15, commanded by Captain Robert Morgan, basically bedded down for the evening and created their own secure perimeter with their backs to the Li River. They had a higher area in front of them that they did not take, which would turn out to be used by the North Vietnamese. That night, the early morning hours of September the 4th, 1967, the North Vietnamese launched an attack. The NVA had 3 regiments, approximately 2,000 to 3,000 men each. Those figures are a little vague in getting the reports from the North Vietnamese. But with 3 regiments, 2 regiments of NVA from the 2nd Division, North Vietnamese Army Division, and 1 regiment of Viet Cong, we're talking between 6,000 and 9,000 effective troops in this area. If you combine the 2 Marines, the 2 Marine battalions, total, we're talking maybe 1,600. So you already see a huge discrepancy in numbers. The North Vietnamese sent a regiment, at least 1 regiment, to annihilate Delta 15 in the early morning hours of September the 4th. They're attacked, their perimeter, it's a night battle, extremely bloody, hard to see. They immediately send for reinforcements of Bravo 15 from Hill 51. You see right across from the Li River there. So Bravo 15 comes to the aid of Delta 15, and then they in turn get ambushed as they're streaming across the Lili River. They form an imperfect perimeter, Bravo and Delta 15, and are in the process of being overrun. Back on Hill 63, which we're talking 20 kilometers separates, that's about a mile and a half, Hill 51 and Hill 63, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines can see and hear what's happening to the southwest of them. They get a call. Bravo and Delta 15 need help immediately, or they're going to be overrun. So 2 companies get the word to come to help, and Marines don't want to say that they need help to reinforce Bravo and Delta 15. Mike 35 and Kilo 35. So 2 companies from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines are sent to reinforce Bravo and Delta 15. These companies were called Bald Eagle companies, and what that meant was that they were basically on call to be quick reaction forces as needed. This is a very large area, the Khe Sanh Valley. There are not enough Marines available to control it, so they have to operate in almost this defensive fashion of being called out when needed. So Mike 35, that's the book that we're focusing on, the men that I were focused on, get the word early in the morning, gear up now. You've got to go out and help out Bravo and Delta 15, dying Delta as they're called, or they're going to be annihilated. Now the Marines had several factors against them as a whole in the Vietnam War, and Mike 35 reflected these factors that were against them. One factor was lack of experience. Mike 35 was very fortunate in to have command of that company a lieutenant, J.D. Murray, who had combat experience. And that combat experience would come in great value that we'll find out later. He had 3 platoon leaders, great men each, but all fresh from the basic school out of the States, no combat experience. He also had not been able to train his company on operations. That was fairly common during World War II, because immediately the companies would be sent out to different areas for control, to patrol, so there was no coordinated training. Another factor was the replacement system. When a grunt or a soldier was killed or badly wounded, an individual replacement fresh from boot camp would then replace that Marine. Well, that Marine, who just came from the United States, often wasn't equipped as well. He certainly didn't have an experience. The other Marines would tend to shun him to a degree because he would make mistakes and get people killed. So there was an isolation there, a cohesiveness issue that really affected combat efficiency. The other key factor that these Marines had to face was malfunctioning weapons. They had been issued the M16. The version that these Marines were issued was an experimental version. There were a couple of factors to it. The barrel was not chromed properly, and improper ammunition was issued. The bottom line effect is that the M16 would jam in combat. And I know that all of you all are aware, it's a automatic weapon. You need to be able to fire quickly to suppress anyone attacking you. The M16 would fire a couple of rounds, jam. The Marines would then have to get a cleaning rod, push it down the barrel of the M16 to knock out the jammed round, fire again, and repeat the process. So effectively, the Marines were equipped with basically muskets from the Revolutionary War when you look at the firing time here. So those were the factors that worked against the Marines, and we'll see in the book They overcame all of those, at least in this particular operation. So, back Hill 63, early morning hours, Lieutenant Murray gets the word that you've got to be at the landing zone immediately. You're going out at first light to help Bravo and Delta. He gets his men ready. They all go to the landing zone, and the night, I believe it's the type of chopper that was ordered to bring them in had been grounded. I can't. I have to look to see the exact name of that chopper. For tail rotor issues, they had been crashing. So the Marines were all about, and they knew this, they were about to get on choppers that could very well effectively crash. They had been grounded, but that was all that was available. So Lieutenant Murray is standing there with his men as the choppers come in. Dust is flying up. The men had been told that the reason that the M16s were jamming was that they were not keeping the weapons clean. Lieutenant Murray knew that that was not the case, but the men had towels wrapped around the chambers of the M16. They would take the plastic from the C rations and put it over the barrel, all in an effort to keep the dust that was flying out of the mechanism of the rifle to try to keep it from jamming. But as I've already explained, it wasn't their fault. It was a manufacturing defect that caused the issue. While they're on the landing zone, and there are two other men, and I hate to single any individual out, but effectiveness for our conversation, I think it's good that we do so. Two men, Father Vincent Capodanno was a Navy chaplain, a Catholic priest. He had served with 1-5 and was now serving with 3-5 as the battalion chaplain. He walks among the men. He's not quite 40 years old, but he is revered by the men because he is a chaplain known to go out with them in firefights in the danger zone and not to stay back at the battalion headquarters. He's among the men doing his best. He's handing out St. Christopher medals. In fact, one Marine who was a Protestant went up to Father Capodanno, requested a St. Christopher medal. At that point, the father had run out of St. Christopher medals to hand out, but he gave his to this Marine. He said, you take mine. The chaplain had been ordered to stay behind at battalion headquarters on Hill 63. He disobeyed that order. As the Marines were loading up into the choppers, he stows away on one of them to go with the Marines on this mission. Once again, a complete violation of orders from the battalion commander. He did it anyway because he was to be and wanted to be with his Marines. So the company, and like I indicated earlier, two companies are being airlifted out, Mike 3-5 and then Kilo 3-5, as you can see on the map, is going to take a different route. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Hillgardner for 1-5, and this gets confusing, is with or will meet up with Kilo 3-5 when they land. 3-5, Mike 3-5, with the other battalion, was placed under the temporary command of the 1-5 commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hillgardner. So the two companies then fly, as you can see on the map. They take the choppers to the landing zones just south of the Lily River. You can see that where the red cursor is. As Mike 3-5 is headed toward the landing zone, the chopper takes fire, so they have to find a different landing zone that's not on Lieutenant Murray's map. So when he lands, he, for a hot moment, doesn't know exactly where he is, where he needs to go to reach Delta Bravo and Delta 1-5. And then he gets a call from Lieutenant Hillgardner saying, "Where are you? Come up here now." Lieutenant Murray gives him the coordinates. The colonel says, "No, you're not. You're not there." And a hot command moment occurs But Lieutenant Murray, if anything, has provided is the commander, and he was not even a captain. And I'll point that out. Is that normally a captain commanded a company, but because combat experience was so valued, this lieutenant was put in command, and thank goodness he was. He improvises. He orders a white phosphorus round fired on his objective. And remember, right now, he doesn't know where he is specifically because the Marines landed in a different landing zone, not on the map. The white phosphorus round landed on the company objective. The white smoke marked the spot, and Lieutenant Murray took his company in column formation immediately toward that objective. The idea was for Mike 35 and Kilo 35 to move southwest separate to the aid of Bravo and Delta 15. Arguably, that clearly not a great move since they would have had more strength together. But Kilo 35 would move down Route 534, which was a dirt road, and Mike 35 would then move slightly northwest of them as they head toward Bravo and Delta 15. So they move in a column. It's hot. It's a cloudless day, very sunny, very quiet, which the Marines picked up on fairly quickly that it was almost too quiet, ominously quiet. Mike 35 moves in column. They take a short break in the village that you can see where the red cursor is to reassess, just take a water break. They get word from Lieutenant Hillgartner, who's at this point southeast of them, saying, "We've found an AK on a boulder. We think the enemy is near. Get up here as soon as you can." Lieutenant Murray at that point had been moving the men in a column. We're talking 164 men, 3 platoons with various attachments, mortars, that sort of thing. He then arranges his company in a wedge formation. And if we go to the next map, we can see what that wedge formation looks like. As they proceed, they receive the warning that the enemy is close. This is a combat formation. First platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Ed Combs, is at the tip of the spear. And then second platoon and third platoon are behind. Third platoon is closer to the village and has the mortars, but they then move out in this formation, once again, heading toward Bravo and Delta to reinforce them with Kilo to the southwest. And I want to point out that Mike and Kilo are not hooked up together. They are not in unison. And we have about a 500 meter or so approximate distance between them. Lieutenant Murray is in basically the center of this formation, and he orders his men forward over a knoll. And the knoll is really a slight rise in the ground. It's very gentle. There's not a lot of camouflage, just some low knee-high bushes, maybe. There are a number of bomb craters on the knoll from various bombing runs. There are some large volcanic rocks on the knoll, and one machine gunner from 2nd Platoon, Ken Fields, remembers slapping one of those rocks as he walked by, and that'll be important later. So the company proceeds over the knoll. And if there are any questions, if there's anything that I'm not explaining, please let me know. And I just want to try to make this clear because it can be confusing. First platoon is coming over this knoll, and Corporal Jack Swan is the point man for the entire company. And Swanee was kind of a crazy guy. He enjoyed being point. As all of you know, that is probably one of the most dangerous positions of any military company because he'll be the first to get shot, basically, if the enemy's in front of him. So he's coming over armed with a grenade launcher, and he views this large rice paddy. And once again, we're talking about midday approximately. It's hot. It's very humid. Each Marine has two canteens. They've been doing a lot of marching on foot already. He looks out onto this rice paddy and he sees a very serene setting. He sees a man and a woman and one water buffalo, basically. And there's a hooch, a small hut out in the rice paddy. But what he notices first off is that it's too quiet. There's no birds. More people would be in the field tending to the rice paddy on a normal day like this, and it was not happening. So immediately his senses are on alert that something is not quite right. He proceeds, and while all this is going on, the Marines have been getting word from Lieutenant Hillgardner at 1-5 to hurry up. Well, if you're looking for the enemy, you need to find a compromise between going fast and being cautious. So Swan and Corporal Vandergriff, his squad leader, were like, we're going just a little bit too fast here. We need to see what's going on. But they're being rushed, and that was uncomfortable that they were being rushed at the time. So Jack Swan walks into the rice paddy, and Lieutenant Ed Combs, who's the first platoon commander, at this point sees some men off to his left and assumes that they're Marines, because remember, to the southeast of Mike 35 is Kilo 35 in the command unit. But the men would move and then drop back down, which was another immediate concern or sign. Jack Swan proceeds forward, and he looks and sees what he thinks is a foot sticking out of a bush. And remember, this is a bright sunny day. There's cover out on this rice paddy. There's brush. There are dikes on the knoll. There's not much cover at all, but there's not a lot of foliage. We do have a tree line, which another map will take a look at that. But Jack Swan sees a foot move. At least that's what he thinks is a foot move. And he yells back at his squad leader, I think I just saw a bush move. His squad leader, Corporal Vandergriff, said, if it moves again, shoot it. So Jack, with his eagle eye, looks again, sees the bush move once more, and then lets loose with his grenade launcher at the bush. At that point, the whole valley opened up with machine gun fire, with mortars. Lieutenant Combs described it as just 1,000 bees. And these men on the knoll didn't have any cover. So suddenly, mortars are coming in, machine guns are coming in, and then they start to see bushes move. The camouflage that these NVA soldiers had put on themselves, the twigs, etc., the fire team movements that they undertook, 3 to 5 man fire teams, it was exceptional. It was the troops that these Marines were up against were very well trained. They didn't even see them. And if Jack Swan had not had such an eagle eye and the company had proceeded down into that rice paddy into a lower depression, the NVA, and we're talking at least one regiment of 1,500 troops, maybe as many as 3,000, would have surrounded and annihilated 164 men. I mean, similar to the Little Bighorn, basically. But because Jack Swan had such an eagle eye, the men had some high ground on that knoll. So now the world is opened up. The attacks are coming. It was a complete, almost picture perfect ambush, except for the fact that the men are on the knoll. Lieutenant Murray then has to jump into action about what to do. So if we go to the next slide, this is the approximate position. And you can see that the NVA, they had the one regiment, and they were reinforced by VC. We're talking 1,500 to, like I said earlier, maybe as many as 3,000 troops in this vicinity. These are likely the same troops that had attacked Bravo and Delta 1-5 earlier in that morning. But part of the North Vietnamese strategy was to lure smaller units of men that could then be separated from larger groups and annihilated piecemeal. So it's a fairly effective strategy. And because they know the countryside, they can set up the ambush well, and they did. So we have in this map off to the northeast, I'm sorry, the northwest, a tree line. And it's the Bajia NVA. It's a regiment reinforced by VC, one of the most effective regiments in the North Vietnamese army. And they're off to you see where the red cursor is, and then to the southwest where first platoon, they're on the knoll, and you have Jack Swan and a few other men down off the knoll, almost into that rice paddy when the ambush was sprung. So immediately the men get down, obviously, and they start to fire. As I've already indicated, we have this issue with the M16 that was jamming. Clearly, there are very many North Vietnamese troops out there. Second platoon, as you can see, is off to the northeast, close to Route 534. Third platoon with the mortars is near the village. Lieutenant Murray is approximately in the center of all of this on the knoll, immediately rushes forward, and thankfully, there were several large bomb craters on the knoll. So Lieutenant Murray gets into a bomb crater approximately in the center where the red cursor is, to get some protection and to set up a command structure. If this Marine company does not have effective leadership from Murray as the commander, down to the platoon commanders, down to the NCOs, the sergeants, the NVA will penetrate and destroy these outnumbered Marines. So Murray and his command company, or his command team, take cover in that crater. A portion of first platoon at the front is able to take cover in a crater there. Third and second platoon are then immediately ordered to come up onto the knoll to provide help. So we're in a very chaotic situation, and this is where Lieutenant Murray's leadership and his experience comes into factor, because you can imagine Marines on a knoll, high ground, knee-high bush, no cover, with AKs and mortars attacking. And as Murray looks out, he sees, I mentioned this before, these NVA fire teams that are camouflaged, that are suppressing fire of the Marines and advancing. And that's the whole goal. Suppress the fire of the Marines, keep their head down, advance so that they can break through the perimeter and then surround and basically kill off piecemeal all of the elements in the company. So Murray acts quickly. He orders the third and second platoon to come forward, and his first goal is to attempt to get a perimeter defense. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the North Vietnamese attacking first platoon from the south, and the rest of the NVA are in the tree line to the northeast. One of the first commands that Lieutenant Murray makes is to have second platoon. Third platoon is rather stranded. They're the farthest back in the village, and they have mortars. They're proceeding forward. But to stop the attack, Lieutenant Murray has to think quickly, has to make command decisions in the moment. And he described combat as a three-dimensional, surreal world where you have so many moving pieces coming at you, and to keep order, to keep discipline is extremely difficult. So the first thing he does, he gets an assessment from his commanders, first, second, and third platoon, the lieutenants. Then he assesses the danger coming from not just the north, but where the tree line is. You can see the cursor that they're NVA to the southeast. So he orders Lieutenant Blecksmith to send 2 squads, approximately 20 men, to attack that tree line. Now, remember, the Marines still don't know exactly how many NVA are out here. It's hard to see. It's extremely chaotic. But if he can send 2 squads to flank and attack any NVA in that tree line, he can get some relief off of first platoon and maybe flank the enemy himself. So Lieutenant Blecksmith at second platoon sends Sergeant Lawrence Peters, and that's the other Marine that I wanted to mention to you. Sergeant Peters, known as Sergeant Pete, was a veteran assault at about age 20. A very young man. I mean, my son's 28, and Sergeant Peters, like I said, was 20. He had experience, and these men had the advantage of these Marines like Sergeant Peters and Lieutenant Murray, who came back for a second tour of duty and did not have to. They had done their time in Vietnam. But both of these men knew that because of their experience, they could save lives. And this battle proved it. Sergeant Peters, 20, they described him as having a bushy mustache. He had grown a mustache. One Marine thought he looked kind of like General Custer. Led these 2 squads off the knoll into the depression toward that tree line. So he's leading about 20 men, some machine guns, toward the tree line. As they approach the tree line, the trees stand up. Once again, the camouflage of the NVA was excellent. And one Marine described he felt like the entire tree line came to its feet. So we have 20 Marines, approximately hundreds of NVA that are now charging them. Sergeant Peters has to act quickly. He quickly realized that his 20 men were vastly outnumbered, and that he had to conduct one of the most difficult maneuvers in combat, and that's a tactical retreat up the knoll without panic. And that's what he did. And we can go to the second map. I may be going back and forth, but you'll see in map number 5, the next one, what Sergeant Peters did was conduct a tactical retreat back up the knoll. And his bravery, there are so many incidents of individual gallantry and bravery that occur just in this one day that it's very hard to enumerate all of them. Sergeant Peters had men hitting the deck. There's not a lot of cover, but he's backing back up the knoll. He acquires a machine gun. He stands while a lot of the men were not. Mortars were coming in. Men were being blown up with mortars, the advancing NVA, the AK-47s. Sergeant Peters is standing with a machine gun. When he sees fire, he fires his machine gun at the enemy, and this way the other men can see where the attacks are coming from, and that they can return fire. It was a way to spot where the enemy was. So he basically kicks them in, pushes them, but because of his leadership, that squad was able to return back onto the knoll and to keep now this all important vital perimeter from not being pierced. If the perimeter of this company is pierced by this attacking enemy, it's lost. The battle's over. If they break through, they'll able to attack Marines from the rear and from all sides, and they'll destroy them piecemeal. If they can keep the perimeter intact and keep the NVA off of them, they'll have a chance to be reinforced or maybe inflict some damage on the enemy. But remember, once again, these Marines are fighting with an M16 that's now starting to jam. So they're having to grab the cleaning rod. If a Marine doesn't have a cleaning rod, they're having to loan it to another Marine because they'll get a shot off, one shot off, then the gun jams. It's supposed to be an automatic weapon. It's not, so they have to push the cleaning rod back down and fire again. So Sergeant Peters does a superb job of conducting that tactical retreat back up to the perimeter to keep it intact. Third platoon from the village, and you can see on this map, is attempting to get to the knoll, but they at one point are attacked. Well, not attacked, but a gunship known as Spooky, which was an old World War II transport propeller-driven craft armed with basically Gatling guns, comes in and mistakes Marines in third platoon for the enemy, and they're pinned down. Thankfully, there are no casualties. They were able to ward off the attack and know that this is friendly fire. But they're stuck back, and they have to get through. You see, there's a draw there that they have to get to the knoll. But they are able to come in and establish this perimeter. So the Marines now have a perimeter. Back on first platoon, down at the south, I guess this is now the southwest, I mentioned command leadership and how important it was. And we have 3 platoon commanders, lieutenants, boot lieutenants that had never seen combat in their lives in charge of these troops. First platoon, Lieutenant Ed Combs is trying to coordinate with his sergeant, Craig Sullivan, who's down at a crater on the lip of the knoll southwest, about where that red cursor is. He's trying to communicate with him when he takes a large round. Some people thought that it was a 50 caliber round, but that would be a huge hole. But he takes a round to the chest, and he's down. And so with the first platoon commander now down, Lieutenant Murray has no command structure. And he's at the command crater, as you can see, just approximately just up where the red cursor is. That's where Lieutenant Murray is. But he can't communicate now with by radio. And we also had trouble with the radios not working. Second platoon, the radio man, Steve Lovejoy, his radio stopped. We had a lot of malfunctioning equipment in this battle. But Lieutenant Murray can't get hold of Ed Combs because he's been not mortally wounded, but near mortally wounded. So Lieutenant Murray makes the impromptu decision, impulsive decision, to leave his command crater by foot with rounds and mortars singing all around him to go find out what happened to his lieutenant and to give control of it, if that lieutenant's down, to his company sergeant, Craig Sullivan. So Lieutenant Murray jumps from the crater, sprints down to another crater, approximately where that red cursor is, leaps into that crater and basically falls on Craig Sullivan, who is the sergeant for First Platoon, gives command to him, and Sully said, Lieutenant, what the hell are you doing down here? And Murray said, you know what? Maybe not the best decision of my life, because if the lieutenant gets killed or mortally wounded, there's a serious problem of leadership and who's going to take over. So Lieutenant Murray gives command of the company, I'm sorry, of the platoon to Sully, the sergeant, because Ed Combs is down, and then sprints back and miraculously gets back to his command crater to try to conduct this battle. So once he's back at the command crater, he has to continue to make decisions. He knows that he's now vastly outnumbered, that there are thousands of NVA, and they're coming. They're advancing by fire teams. The Marines have that malfunctioning M16. It's just going to be a matter of time, and not a lot of time, before the Marines are overrun, the perimeter is pierced, and they're all killed. So he has to make some decisions quickly. One of the first decisions he makes is to call in tear gas, a CS gas drop on the whole area to try to push back the NVA attack. So jets come in, drop tear gas, but the jets are high. So the tear gas drop is not that effective. But some did hit near 2nd Platoon. And I mentioned earlier with 2nd Platoon, yes, that where the red cursor is, that Steve Lovejoy, the radio operator, his radio had stopped working, so that there was a serious communication issue with 2nd Platoon. But as the tear gas comes in, he notices that he does not have a gas mask. The tear gas is coming in. He's halfway up the slope, really not in a protected spot. So not only is tear gas coming in, but bullets are flying and he's about to get killed. He feels someone grab him by his radio pack, pull him into a small crater. He looks up, and it's Father Vincent Capodanno. The chaplain was a stowaway on one of the choppers, had come in with 3rd Platoon, and when the advance had hit, Capodanno on his own ran up to where the action was. He was, once again, a chaplain who had no fear of combat and was going to be there where his men were. And he's now at 2nd Platoon, where that red cursor is, pulls Lovejoy into a crater and hands him his gas mask and said, you're going to need this more than I do. And then he disappears. And Lovejoy was astounded that the chaplain was not taking cover as bullets were flying and mortars dropping, but that he continued on his way. The first tear gas drop didn't work, but Murray is now onto a second strategy to try to save the day. And this would turn out to be probably his most effective strategy, and that was to call in close air support. I mentioned the gunships with the Gatling guns. We also have Phantom jets. We have Crusaders, Skyhawks that could drop napalm and different bombs out onto the enemy. And that, of course, was something that the enemy didn't have in response. What the enemy did have in response were anti-aircraft pieces in this area. And I pointed out to you how the enemy had control of the land. Well, they planned things pretty well. Those volcanic rocks that I spoke about earlier, and I'm getting ahead a little bit, but there were Vietnamese hidden inside those rocks that were later killed, just waiting for the Marines to arrive. There were tunnels. If you look at the red dot on where the cursor is near 2nd Platoon, there were tunnels where NVA were popping up within the perimeter on the knoll to fire at Marines inside the perimeter. So it was very well planned, the ambush very well laid. But Murray then calls in close air support. So over the knoll is a Cessna Piper Cub. Basically, is what it is. It's a small Cessna prop plane. Corporal Captain Tom Redman is a spotter in the plane, and his job is to view the battlefield, which from his viewpoint is now covered with smoke, hard to see, and he has to know where Marines are and where the enemy is before he calls in jets to drop bombs. One of the greatest horrors that these spotters, they call them, like I said, they call them bird dogs, would be for them to make a mistake and to drop bombs or napalm on their own men. So Murray calls Redmond and says we need close air support. So they call in close air support, and I believe that would have been from Da Nang. I'm not 100% sure about that. They call him in to get help. I mentioned the draw, and if you look at the cursor there, also we're 3rd Platoon, and we can now, if we go to the next map, that would be map number 6. And as I'm describing all of this action, one thing that Lieutenant Murray pointed out to me, all of these different elements that I'm speaking about, they do occur linearly, but they also occur at the same time. You've got one Marine, say in 3rd Platoon, and his battle is the draw, and he has no idea what's happening to the men in his company on 1st Platoon, because his battlefield is basically the Marine to his left and to his right, and the enemy to his front, and what's happening from behind. So all of these elements that I'm speaking about, a lot of them are occurring at the same time. A lot of them are occurring linearly, but it's hard in a presentation like this or in a book to talk about it because a lot's happening and it's all going on. So 3rd Platoon and the mortars are able to make it to the knoll. They're able to help secure that perimeter on the knoll. In that draw, NVA now are seeking to completely surround Mike 35. Now, you can see to the south, what is that, the southeast, Kilo 35 and the 15 Command Company are only, say, 500 or more meters away. But they never come to Mike 35's aid. I'm not going to place any sort of judgment on that because I'm not there. I don't know the situation. I don't know how many Vietnamese are between Mike and Kilo in that area. But I do know that since the companies were separated, it makes it an easier job to kill Marines for the NVA. So Kilo 35 is in that area. Mike 35 is to the northwest. Along that draw of 3rd Platoon, NVA now come down that draw in an attempt to surround all of the Marines and continue this attack. One of the first successful airstrikes, either from a Phantom or a Crusader, was down that draw. And Lieutenant Redmond commented to Lieutenant Murray that he sees thousands of what he think, or hundreds of Marines coming to his aid, points in that direction. Lieutenant Murray says, there are no Marines there. That's not the enemy. So bombs are dropped and NVA are killed, and that creates some relief for the company. So we've now gone on for approximately, it's hard to say, maybe not even an hour or more. It's now in the afternoon. The NVA are not letting up. The Marines are starting to take casualties. Back on where Sergeant Peters was on second platoon, that's where the NVA had significantly advanced. You see where the pressure's coming from that tree line area, and then from the southwest at first platoon. But second platoon is starting to take the brunt of a great deal of this attack, and men are falling. Sergeant Peters, with his machine gun, standing, firing, his luck doesn't last because he's such a target, because he's literally standing with a machine gun with the belts of ammunition flying. The NVA see him, and he gets shot. He falls to his knees. As he's falling to his knees, he asks for another gun, but his time is done. Another Marine comes to him to give him some aid, and Sergeant Peters, his last breath, he says the Lord's Prayer, and that Marine remembers it to this day, how Sergeant Peters at age 20 said the Lord's Prayer as he gave his last breath. For his heroism, Sergeant Peters would be awarded the Medal of Honor. The Marine that I spoke about, who listened to Sergeant Peters say the Lord's Prayer himself during this attack, at one point felt all was lost because the NVA were overtaking them. He turns to the sky and sees God and has a conversation with God. It's one of those moments in combat that, to me, it was amazing to listen to him, to hear God's disapproval of killing his fellow man, but that God giving him, I guess, the will to survive or to know that he was there. You can read it in the book. The last words this Marine heard from this vision that he had were that God was saying, I am, and then the battle came back to him, and he was back into the battle. As I said, second platoon is in great dire need of help. The NVA attack is the hardest at this point. As all this is going on, Father Capodanno again is now with second platoon, and he's giving first aid. He's giving last rites. One Marine sees that he's wounded, sees blood on him at some point. Some Marines remember the stole that a priest wears. Other Marines don't remember that. But what they do remember is that this chaplain is not taking any cover with all of the constant barrage of bullets and mortars, is trying to help Marines and is trying to provide first aid. Near second platoon, closer toward first platoon, so a little bit maybe roughly in between the two platoons, and this is very rough. Private Fred Tankey, who recently passed away, and he was awarded the Bronze Star for his actions, sees a machine gun unit, NVA machine gunner, come up toward his spot, and the machine gun fires, and a corpsman, Armando Leal, takes the hit and starts calling for help himself. Leal, the corpsman, was rendering first aid to other Marines that had been wounded. Tankey goes to Leal, and Leal has been struck in the femoral artery in his leg. That's a lethal wound. It's going to bleed out if you don't get immediate attention. He asks Tankey to put pressure on it. Tankey puts pressure on the wound. He can't keep the pressure because the blood is very slippery. And he sees that machine gunner now take aim at him, and he distinctly remembers, Tankey remembers the machine gunner smiling at him and almost toying with him as he fingers the trigger of his machine gun. Tankey turns to fire, and his M16 has jammed. It doesn't work. and now he's a dead man. Liao says, take cover, you've got to leave me. Tanky tries to drag him up the slope, but as the bullets are flying in, he finally jumps into a crater. Liao's gone or going. He turns around. He breaks his nose as he lands in the crater. He looks around, tries to get a cleaning rod to clean the M16 to shoot the machine gunner. And as he does so, he sees out of the corner of his eye Father Capodanno rushing toward the downed corpsman Armando Leal. He yells at Capodanno to watch for the gunner, watch out for the gunner. It's too late. The machine gunner fires, hits the chaplain, who falls to his knees. And then, as the chaplain goes down, other NVA attack him. One Marine sees a knife come at the father, and he's killed. So Father Capodanno is killed for his actions on this day. He also would be awarded the Medal of Honor. Tanky gets back in the crater, is able to uh, I forgot to mention that he had had a finger shot off in all of this, so he's got his hand bandaged and is now using a cleaning rod to break out the rounds, and is trying to keep the NVA at bay. Back in the command crater, Lieutenant Murray is in the same situation. He's going to be overrun. What's happening is not enough. Napalm is being dropped. Back where Lieutenant Swan is, at the lip of the crater. So you see the cursor, if you go to where it says Ba Jia, just at down back south, right about there approximately. Jack Swan, the point man, has been now with his face in the dirt behind a dike, pinned down by the NVA since the moment that the ambush was sprung. He was able to fire at the bush. He was able to get another round from his grenade launcher into a hooch where firing was coming from. But now he's had to remain completely still because the NVA think he's dead. They're watching him. If he moves, in fact, he attempted to move once and took a round in his pack. Luckily, it was his pack and not his body. So he basically is having to keep his face in the dirt through this entire battle. If he moves, he's a dead man. Off to his left is a new guy, a private, who was in the squad coming toward him by the name of Howard Haney. Haney took a round immediately in the chest and fell right when this ambush was sprung. He had a heavy pack. A lot of these Marines carried extra ammunition. They carried mortar rounds. They carried, like I mentioned, the canteens. So it's a heavy pack on his back. The pack on his back that's pressing on him saved Howard Haney's life on this day because of the pressure to keep him from bleeding out, because has suffered a chest wound. The pack was keeping him alive. At some point, Haney and Swan speak to each other, and Swan, being the veteran, says, "Be quiet, stay down. We can't do anything." Howard Haney thinks he's going to bleed out, but he has to stay then in that spot until the battle's over. Back at the command crater, Lieutenant Murray, looking at all of the pieces of this puzzle, has to do something. The pressure's too great. The airstrikes are doing a good job, but they're not doing as good a job as they could. So he determines to call in a second drop of tear gas, this time by chopper. So he calls it in, and this move would prove to be controversial because there are a number of wounded Marines out in the field, critically wounded, that are now going to don't have access to gas masks that are now going to have their eyes and their lungs, and it could kill them with a serious tear gas drop. But Lieutenant Murray has to do something or his men will be killed. So he calls in a second drop of tear gas, this one much closer. And one Marine recalls seeing these choppers come over that are taking fire from the NVA, and these small canisters, like the old 35 millimeter canisters, pour out of these choppers as gas is spewing onto the knoll. This drop of the CS gas was much more effective. And Lieutenant Murray has gone on record, because it was controversial, and other Marines have corroborated what he says, that the NVA attack took a serious pause with that CS gas drop. Many of the Marines that had gas masks, those gas masks didn't work. One, Carlton Clark, who was the Marine who had the vision, that, and it immediately fogged up, and he coughed, and it was bad. The equipment malfunctions that happened on this operation are rather surreal, but the Marines got past it. So there was a pause with the CS gas. The first real pause in this entire combat operation. The bird dog is still circling, and in that small Cessna, he, as now afternoon starts to approach and the sun starts to set, has to make a decision as to where the Marines are so that he can continue to call in airstrikes and where the enemy is. At one point, I had mentioned Captain Redmond went off station because of fuel, and the second bird dog came in, commanded by Rob Whitlow. He was known as Blackcoat when with the radio calls, is now flying as guns are shot at him. Remember, there are anti-aircraft weapons out here. He has to know where the jets are so he doesn't get in the way of the jets dropping bombs. And as I said before, he has to know where the Marines are. So he is about to call in an airstrike to take out an anti-aircraft gun. And that anti-aircraft gun is basically between Mike 3.5 and Kilo 3.5. If the red cursor goes more toward that area right there, there's a large anti-aircraft emplacement there. He calls in a strike on that emplacement, and immediately as the bombs start to strike, he gets word from Kilo 3.5 that they're bombing their own men. So you can imagine the feeling that Rob Whitlow felt. He spoke about the nausea, that he almost threw up, that he couldn't believe that he could have just called in an airstrike on Americans. Thankfully, he immediately got word from Kilo 3.5 that they were close, but they had not killed any Americans in that airstrike. He's looking at his fuel gauge, and as he's circling this battlefield, he's now seeing that he's about to lose fuel. So his options are to head back to the airbase, which would have been probably Da Nang, to get fuel and come back, or to stay over the battlefield and give these Marines this close air support coverage that is so needed. And he had a .45 pistol, and he's got a pilot, and he's in the back as the spotter. They both said, we'll just go down. I mean, if we run out of fuel in the Piper Cub, in the Cessna, and we'll just take our chances and crash, but we're going to stay on station to keep these airstrikes coming in. And that's what they did. So the airstrikes are coming in. things are looking a little better. At one point, I mentioned one of these aircraft, anti-aircraft emplacements. Some jets come in, and I'm not sure if they were, I believe that they were Phantom jets, one in a line. And this is a controversial witness because some Marines say they saw it and the other Marines say it never could have happened. But it's now getting to be dark. One jet comes in toward a different anti-aircraft emplacement, and it would probably have been if you go take the cursor and go approximately to where the tree line is. There is another anti-aircraft emplacement there. One jet comes in as bait. The anti-aircraft gun lights up because it's starting to get dark and visibility is not as great. When that gun lights up, it exposes their location. Another jet is immediately following, sees where the anti-aircraft gun had fired, and drops bombs on it and completely takes it out. Now, some Marines swear that they saw this. Other Marines say that it couldn't have happened, but the Marines that saw it swear by it, and a cheer erupts from where second platoon is when they see that gun emplacement being taken out. Now it's starting to get dark. Things have calmed down, if that's the right word. It's really not, but the perimeter is still intact. It's gotten dark. The air support, the close air support, and the tear gas, along with the Marines holding the line, have stymied this Vietnamese attack. And as I mentioned, we're talking at least 1,500 Vietnamese against 164 Americans. That number could actually be conservative because there were probably closer to, say, 6,000 Vietnamese available in the vicinity. But one Vietnamese commander put the number at about 1,500. That's still a significant odds in favor of the North Vietnamese. Down toward first platoon, where Craig Sullivan is in the crater, it now comes to the point of how can we get some of our men out? What can we do? Down where Craig Sullivan is, Jack Swan and Howard Haney and some other men are still out in that rice paddy pinned down. He starts to consolidate and determine how he is going to rescue his men. He asks for a volunteer to go back to the command crater, and the young man, I believe his name was Gutierrez, I'll have to take a look, to get reinforcements. This Marine, and I apologize on his name, I think it was Gutierrez, but I'm not sure, comes out of the crater and immediately is shot by an NVA sniper who's watching them. Craig Sullivan, they tries to save his life. He conducts a tracheotomy on the Marine with a ballpoint pen in an attempt to save that man's life, but he could not. He died. So the NVA are still there. They have to make a determination on what to do, but it's now starting to get dark. At some point in all of this, the NVA decide to stop. And the determination was made. The reason that they did not continue the attack is that the combination of the close air support, the bombs, the tenacious Marine defense, the casualties were simply too great to continue. So they paused, I guess would be the correct word. When that pause was felt, the Marines were then able to bring in the wounded. Jack Swan and Howard Haney were both brought in. The perimeter was consolidated. Lieutenant Murray began to make rounds along the perimeter, telling his men to hold the line. Around the spot of where second platoon is, he steps out toward the tree line, and because of the darkness, for a moment lost his way, but was able to come back in to the command crater. I mentioned Lieutenant Ed Combs with an open chest wound. He's now in the command crater. His wound is so severe that he actually can see his lung, but it's patched. The corpsmen that were alive, at least two corpsmen were killed, were able to patch him up, but he has determined, he felt that he's not going to make it, that he's going to die. So he asks for someone to baptize him. He had never been baptized. Of course, there was a Navy chaplain, but he had been killed at this point. Another Marine who was a Catholic baptizes him. He asked if Combs was a Catholic, and he said no. But on the battlefield, it didn't matter. So he took some solace in becoming baptized. He is in and out of consciousness as medevac choppers are beginning to be called in, and he remembers a small breeze on his face. And he looks up, and it's Jack Swan, who had been the point man of 1st Platoon, who was now in and was trying to give his lieutenant some comfort with the small fan that he had. Lieutenant Combs had repeatedly asked for water, but because of the nature of his wound, being an open chest wound, protocol stated that would be one of the worst things to do. So because of his great thirst and he could not be given water, Jack Swan tried to give him a little bit of relief with a small fan. At this point now, medevacs need to be called in. So Chuck Goebel, who is with the command crater, takes a small spotlight or strobe light, comes out of the command crater, stands basically on the rim in a very exposed position that probably, just an hour or two before would have resulted in his instant death, and sends a signal for the approaching medevacs. So medevac choppers were able to come in and to be able to lift out some of the wounded, including Lieutenant Combs. And I can't say enough about those who came to help the wounded, who risked life and limb. One of those choppers put on his landing lights and immediately started to take fire from NVA, but turned it back off again. And under the cover of darkness, they were able to bring wounded out. But they were able to get these wounded men, like Lieutenant Combs, to a hospital ship or to Da Nang for immediate medical treatment, and that saved innumerable lives. So now it's dark. I indicated that they're starting to bring in the wounded and the dead. Machine Gunner Fields, mentioned from 2nd Platoon, is holding the perimeter, and body bags are now being placed behind the Marines. There's one near him, and he gets curious as to who that person is in the body bag, whether it was a friend, somebody that he knew. Curiosity overtook him, so he went and opened it, took a look. In the flash of mortar fire or bomb fire, the area lights up, and he notices that there was the glint of an officer's insignia on his collar, as well as a cross. And he is dumbfounded and surprised that it was the battalion chaplain who had come out with them. So he makes his way back to the command crater in the darkness, yells down. He said, "We've got a chaplain up here who's dead." And Lieutenant Murray was completely surprised that I didn't even know he was with us. And it became a big issue with the battalion that this chaplain came out and was killed later on. So finally, the men hold the perimeter. Dawn comes slowly, and the men were able to go out and see. They take a patrol toward the Lele River. I believe it was 3rd Platoon did that, and they just saw the destruction that the bombs had wrought on the NVA. The NVA had gone. They had left. There was no ambush. They had back with Bravo and Delta, not on this map, but they had left that area. Day one of Operation Swift, a day that started out as a rescue operation, a quick reaction force that then went on for 10 to 14 days for these Marines to quell NVA activity in the Khe Sanh Valley. Another issue with the Vietnam War is that when Marines would go to one location, conquer and win the territory, because there were so few men in the area, they would have to leave an area that they had just conquered only for that area to be taken over again by the enemy. And then Marines and soldiers and Americans would then have to go back and reconquer it. And that happened time and time again. This area of the Khe Sanh Valley had a lot of VC. A lot of the villagers were in league with the North Vietnamese, and that became apparent later. A few notes. I mentioned Lieutenant Combs. Many years later, when a reunion was held, approximately 2005 or so, Jack Swan and Ed Combs meet. Ed Combs survived his chest wound, and this was the first time that they met. And Jack Swan gave him, in a case engraved, a little blue fan that was battery powered, and on a plaque it said, "To Lieutenant Ed Combs, my greatest fan." So humor was very important for these Marines. Ed Combs became a Catholic after he was baptized as on the battlefield, and that's basically the story of this one day. There are many elements of heroism and gallantry that I've left out just for time, but I would love to answer any questions about this specific day, about the challenges these men faced. What's amazing to me is that despite all of these challenges and despite the vast numerical superiority the enemy had, plus knowledge of the land, that our Americans, our Marines prevailed. If you look at this from just a combat or a battle perspective, the Marines won this battle, if you want to call it that. The NVA left the ground. They were the ones that stopped the attack. They were the ones that retreated. And the Operation Swift that went on for the next 10 days to 2 weeks to continue to mop up the area would show later how the 2nd NVA division was damaged by this operation, because in the upcoming Tet Offensive, part of the NVA strategy was an attack on the Khe Sanh Valley. That did not materialize. Of course, there were attacks elsewhere, but because of what happened here in September, this was no longer an area of strength for the North Vietnamese. So, as in so many cases in this war, the Americans would win the battle, but because of larger decisions of strategy and politics, would have to give up the territory or give up, end the war as it ended 50 years ago, as we all saw. So I would like to now, I've covered a whole lot. What questions anybody has, if there's anything that is confusing or that I have not illustrated well enough, please let me know.
I think everyone can tell by, Doyle's presentation here that it is a book filled with exceptional detail. And you just have to admire what these men went through that day. All right, Q&A time, Linda.
All right, sir. Just speak into the mic here.
At the start of, am I live here? Okay. At the start of the combat, I believe you said there was 164 members of the Corps on site. At the end of the interspersion, the kind of the darkness and the withdrawal, what was the live count or the dead count at that point?
I believe, and I might have to double check, but I believe that there were 16 Marines killed on this particular day, Marines and Navy corpsmen. So that's a testament to, once again, the Marines and this leadership, that it wasn't a whole lot worse. Now, many more, I believe, this Operation Swift, if you see at the beginning of my book, it's dedicated to, let's see, I want to get the number correct. For the entire Operation Swift, 127 Marines and Navy corpsmen were killed, and that would be September 4th through the 15th.
Doyle, thank you for a spectacular discussion. Educated enormously.
But
Have you ever been to Hanoi to discuss the battle from their point of view?
well, I had was very fortunate to go with a number of these Marines back in 2000. I believe it was 2009 to Vietnam, and a lot of the Marines that were on Operation Swift, unfortunately, a lot of those men have passed on. But we found the battlefield. We found the knoll. Looks completely different. I think it even looks very different now than it did in 2009. There were large trees on it. But with us, and you can see in the book, there was a former NVA colonel who was an officer about the rank of a lieutenant, actually on Operation Swift. He did not participate on that day because he himself was wounded, and he provided some excellent feedback about the war, about the Americans. One thing that I thought was two things from that observation was, from his point of view, the American war in Vietnam were a series of wars. I mean, with the French, the Americans, and he even commented on having to fight the Chinese. So to him, it was a long, I guess, conflict from his point of view of taking outsiders out of Vietnam. What was also very moving to me was to watch the Marines on the knoll with that former NVA colonel and the brotherhood that was between everyone, between not only the Marines, but also with the former enemy that was there. And he was an excellent tour guide and provided great resources as far as to what the strength of the NBA and their objectives. So it was just I felt very much an outsider and tried to be invisible, basically, because they all were there on that day in 1967. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
My question is, can you hear me? My question is more basic. Is that battle unique, or were there a lot of battles just like that one all over Vietnam?
This was that's actually a great question. We talked about Lions of Medina and Operation Medina last year. Similar in these aspects, a small unit of Marines that were almost always under strength. I'd said approximately 165, but under strength in enemy territory, ambushed by far superior numbers. That seemed to be a common theme in a number of these battles in Vietnam because the enemy knew the land. They had the support of the local population for the most part, but they did not have assets like close air support, uh, tear gas, those sorts of things. So they had to be judicious in their attacks. And even in this particular case, when an ambush is sprung early, they get caught in the open by the bombs, by the napalm, by the close air support, and that turned the tide against them. So, but to answer hopefully I've answered your question. That was a common theme, and it was actually fairly successful for them, at least in producing casualties.
Another question, sir. I was astounded when you were talking about the rifles and the problems that they were having with them. And I'm just wondering, did this happen with all sorts of weapons throughout the war?
I'm only aware of the M16, and speaking about Operation Medina, that operation occurred in October of 1967. A different battalion and regiment in a different part of the country, but they report no problems with the M16. Certain Army units reported no problems with the M16. It had to do with two issues: improper chroming on the inside of the barrel that kind of gummed things up, and improper ammunition that was not calibrated, if that's the right word, for those weapons, that contributed to that factor that caused a round not to eject, to jam, and one round behind the other one, requiring that stoppage to be blocked out. But to answer your question, the issue with the gas masks was an issue on Operation Swift. We talked about those choppers with the tail rotors. They had been grounded. There were no reports of issues on Operation Swift. So I am personally not aware of any other issues, but that doesn't mean they didn't exist. These are just the ones that I've been made aware of.
Hello, wonderful job. Thank you very much. Just a casual question because you asked any questions. If I was over there. If I was in that situation, I would have been talking out of ammo in 30 seconds. How does the Corps have a standard operation procedure on how to manage ammunition in a situation like that?
That's a great question. And part of that, I want to thank all of the Marines that I spoke with, because they trusted me with this story, and every question were just incredible. As far as ammunition, what I can tell you is that for the machine gunners, you had Marines that were carrying rounds and rounds of ammunition in. On this operation, I don't recall how many clips each man was carrying, but they would basically carry as much as they could, so as to not run out of ammunition. But specifically on ammunition and not running out of it, I'm sure that there are many protocols in place, and a lot of the grunt's job was to haul ammunition, and that's not just machine gun bandoliers, it's mortars, it's carrying parts of the machine gun, it's carrying the mortars themselves. That doesn't count the M16 ammunition and those weapons. It doesn't count the at least 2 canteens of water that the men quickly consumed. So there's a photo of one Marine in the book equipped on how he was basically, and that in many cases, some cases there would be flak jackets. In this case, the Marines, because they were going where they were going, didn't wear them. It's just too much. Hopefully that answers your question.
Doyle, why were mortars not a significant factor in this battle?
The mortars were with 3rd Platoon and back in the village. So they were late getting up to the knoll. And I mentioned that friendly fire had them pinned down, but then, then they were also pinned down themselves. But the mortars were effective. That's one element that I didn't speak about. They did fire, and they uh, were a contributing factor. But in this chaos of combat, I mentioned Sergeant Peters standing up and firing where he saw NVA. They were hard to find. And, as you know, with mortars, you've got to get your range in and do what you can. So they did fire from the village, and then as they were brought up toward the knoll, they then became more effective. But then I believe at some point they ran out of ammunition. They simply ran out of mortars.
Well, I'm going to take the last quick question. I understand you have a 3rd book that's just about completed, and it's going to be published next year, and it's going to take a little different direction. It's a historical novel, I understand. Would you tell us quickly about your 3rd book?
Absolutely. Thank you. So I did both of these works on Vietnam, and I love nonfiction, but I'm a creative person, and I thought historical fiction would be a great next move. So I wanted to find a unique character, and World War II was the scene. So to answer your question, I found a French Grand Prix champion who had been a World War I combat pilot and won basically the Formula One Grand Prix championship and Le Mans for Bugatti in between World War I and World War II. Became an executive with Bugatti. He was a celebrity. Everybody knew him. His name was Robert Benoist, Benoist, a Frenchman. At about the age of 40, decides to go undercover as a member of Britain's Special Operation Executive to conduct sabotage in occupied France. He's a Frenchman. Everybody knew him. He couldn't hide. Everybody knew who he was. It would be like some actor or whatever these days. And basically became a secret agent under the thumb of the Gestapo in Paris and in the Brittany region for the Special Operation Executive. So I took his story, basically tried to drop into his skin and to tell his war from his point of view. And that book is finished. It's now waiting for the right publisher to offer me the best deal. And we have to think of those things. And hopefully I'll know something about that before Christmas. And fingers crossed, we might have that out by the fall of next year. Unfortunately, these things take some time, but it was pretty exciting to enter that world and to look at there was no one to interview, so you had to look at records and witness statements and other works, but it was a great kind of change for me for what I did. What's great about these Vietnam books was that I actually spoke to the men that were there, so they are the ones that can tell that story. Hopefully that answers. Currently it's called Codename Lionel, because that was this individual's code name with the British SOE.
Well, thank you so much. We will look forward to it.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very, very much, Doyle. And thank all of you. And just a reminder, next presentation is December 8th, and Edith Flynn will talk about Americans held hostage. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank all of you. Thank you. I really appreciate it.